Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Even good men can develop bad habits. And even as God's hand-picked candidate to lead the people of Israel, David was just as susceptible to this problem as anyone else in the kingdom. Chapter 10 of 2 Samuel reveals a particularly dangerous bad habit that David had developed that was going to cause serious issues in the not-so-distant future. While some leaders struggle with delegating responsibility, David seemed to have no problem doing so. In fact, we'll see him abdicating his God-given role as Israel's commander-in-chief and leaving it all up to Joab, the commander of his armies. As king, David was responsible for protecting Israel from its enemies. He had a job to do, and yet it seems as if David was making a habit of staying home when he should have been at war. Bad habits don't just happen. They're developed over time, and in time, they can lead to seriously dangerous consequences. Chapter 10 gives us a glimpse into that part of David's role as the king of Israel that required him to defend and protect his kingdom. One of David's primary responsibilities as king was to finish what Joshua and the people of Israel had begun when they first entered the land of promise. Chapter 8 chronicles David's victories against the Philistines, Moabites, Amalekites, Edomites, Ammonites, and Syrians. But in chapter 10 we find him having to go to war yet again, because the newly crowned king of the Ammonites chose to reject David's offer of peace. David had sent emissaries to Hanun, the new king of the Ammonites, offering his condolences over the death of Hanun's father. But Hanun's princes and advisers saw David's overtures as a veiled attempt to spy out the city and report back to David concerning its defenses. So they took David's emissaries, shaved off half their beards, and cut off the lower portions of their garments, leaving them exposed. Then they sent them on their way. This intentional slight left David with no alternative but to declare war on the Ammonites. And the Ammonites sought out the services of Syrian mercenaries to assist them in their upcoming battle with Israel. The noteworthy thing about this entire scenario is that it reveals how David handled these continuing military excursions. This event was most likely early on in David's reign. He spent the formative portions of his rule dealing with the enemies that surrounded Israel, and was constantly having to go to battle with one nation or another. David was the warrior king. It was his job, and he did it well. But even in this case, we see David, as king, setting a dangerous precedence by sending Joab, his military commander, to do battle with the Ammonites, while David remained behind. It's also notable that David doesn't seem to seek the counsel of God before going into battle. It appears that he took the debasing treatment of his men by the Ammonites as a personal slap in the face and was determined to do something about it. So he sent his troops, under the leadership of Joab, to deal with it. And Joab would find himself outmanned. It would only be through his skillful leadership that the enemy was defeated. But even Joab recognized that any hopes of victory were up to God. Just prior to the battle, he told his men, "Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people, and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." 2 Samuel 10, verse 12. Joab was doing his job, but he was also relying on God. But David remained back in Jerusalem. He would not enter the fight until after the Ammonites and Syrians were routed by Israel. When he received word that the Syrians had mustered their own army against Israel, he personally led his troops into battle, ultimately defeating the Syrians. So why is all of this so important? It sets up chapter 11, where we'll find David, the warrior king, once again facing battle, but choosing to stay behind in Jerusalem. David had established a very unwise habit. Chapter 11 will open with the seemingly innocuous words, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem." 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. We'll see yet again David sending Joab and his troops into battle while he remained safely behind. At a time when most kings would do battle, David would choose to remain in his palace, delegating his duties as commander-in-chief. But David's primary responsibility as king of Israel was to secure the land and to remove the pagan nations from among them. He was charged by God to carry out his command, given to Moses and then passed on to Joshua. "But you shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 20, verses 17 through 18. As long as there were nations threatening the physical and spiritual well-being of Israel, David had one job to do: fight. He wasn't to delegate that responsibility to another. But David appears to have had a problem with shirking responsibility. You can see it in his role as a father. Time and time again, David failed to lead his growing family well. His obsession with women led to him having many children. But it's one thing to bring children into the world, and another thing to father and lead them once they're here. David appears to have left much of the training of his children up to his many wives. And as we'll see, this abdication of his God-given responsibility would come back to haunt him. David enjoyed victories over the Ammonites and the Syrians, in large part due to the leadership and faith of Joab. But David's decision to remain at home while his armies went into battle was going to prove to be a bad habit that produced even worse results. When we fail to do what God has called us to do, because we're distracted by the cares of this world, we may experience success in life, but the time will come when our victories turn into defeats. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, reminded them that their salvation had been for a purpose, not because they were good people who deserved to be saved, but because God had something for them to do. God saved you by His grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus, so we can do the good things He planned for us long ago. Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 10. Like David, we're here for a reason. We have a God-given job to do. We can't afford to shirk our responsibility or decide to delegate our job to someone else. When we fail to do what God has called us to do, we risk His discipline. He won't fall out of love with us, but He will allow us to experience the painful lessons that come with disobedience.